So today, I'd like essentially to give you the same talk I gave 2 years ago. Same outline. With a small glitch, that in the meantime, we have worked out all these tiny details that make the difference between something that is promising and something where actually I can show you real data. So this essentially is the work of the PhD of Corentin Bertrand, who is in the room and is going to be here starting for 2 months away. And in collaboration with Olivier, who you know, and Serge Florence, my colleague in Grenoble, who did the energy part that we will benchmark against. So I'd like to start the talk by actually showing you the final slide. And but before I can show you the data, I need to introduce the model very briefly. So everything today will be about the impurity, Anderson impurity, just a single impurity with interaction U when I have 2 electrons on top, some epsilon D here, and then I couple that to a bath with a coupling gamma. So this essentially is a 1D infinite chain, weakly coupled or not weakly coupled to my impurity. So that's essentially a good model for a quantum dot. And since it is non-equilibrium, I will put also a bias voltage here, V bias again across this thing, and then see what kind of current and things flows. So that's the final slide. Let me show it to you directly. Here we plot the spectral function, so essentially the local density of state, as a function of frequency on the interaction. And so without interaction, you see you have like a broad resonance at just my level. And then I switch on interaction, it gets narrower. That's essentially I start to build the Kondo resonance. And then eventually it splits, because here I have a small bias voltage into essentially, the system is trying to build 2 Kondo resonances to the 2 Fermi levels. So essentially it splits. And you can also see here the 2 Hubbard bands that are to fill up. So essentially, the talk will be about how we can actually get to this plot. Something I should say right away, that this is actually a single quantum Monte Carlo run. So it's something very nice about this technique, that since it is, we do expansion in power of U, we can get all the U dependence in one run, and also all the frequency dependence in one run. That's a new feature that we added during these 2 years. Okay, so this is my outline. Actually, it's the same outline as Michel this morning. So first, I need to tell you how we calculate. So we're doing an expansion in power of the interaction, and we calculate the few 10 coefficients here. So first, I need to tell you how we actually do get these first 10 coefficients. That's going to be the first part. And right after me, Emmanuel will tell you about the different expansion in power of hybridization. It's a complementary technique. I will try to compare a bit the two at some point. And then once we have these guys, how do we reconstruct the full function out of them? And then I will show you the data eventually. So I would say the new idea here, it's not really new, but that one should take the analytical structure of this function seriously. So essentially, the idea is not to try to resum, it's to try to understand the analytical structure, and once you understand it, then it becomes actually quite easy to resum. Okay, so let me start with the first part, how to calculate these guys. Oops, sorry. So actually, before I show you how to calculate them, this is the raw data at the end of after the quantum Monte Carlo run, what we get, for instance, for the self-energy, is self-energy as a function of frequency at order 2, at order 4, at order 6, at order 10, on order 10, and you can continue until you're tired or you have no computational power anymore. Okay, so the question is how to get these guys. So we do everything in Keldysh because it's not out of equilibrium. So that's my Keldysh 101 slide. Keldysh is actually much simpler than it's usually thought. So it's very simple. We start with a non-interacting. Then you switch on interaction. And then you use this essentially the evolution operator in interaction representation. Then you measure whatever you want to measure. And then you want to go back to the non-interacting state, so you switch it back. Right? So whenever you hear this Keldysh contour, it means something very simple, is that you either, whenever you have a vertex, either you are switching on the interaction, and then it says to be on the upper contour, or you are switching it off, and then you are on the downward contour. Okay, so then we do an expansion in power of the interaction, and we get Wick's theorem, and we can just apply the usual machinery, except that we have an additional index that tells us whether we are switching on or off the interaction. So you can write a very simple expression, which looks messy, but it's actually very simple. So anything you want to calculate, like for instance, a green function, is integration over the vertices, sum over the same number of Keldysh indices. You have the vertices, and then you have a weak theorem, you write it in terms of a determinant, and this is well known in this room. Just a simple determinant of one-body green functions. And these guys, we know very well how to calculate them. Okay, so this was actually the situation 2 years ago already. And the new thing that we did was, at that time, was to explicitly do the sum over the Keldysh indices. We don't sample them, we explicitly do the sum, and that automatically cancels for given times all disconnected diagrams. So it's equivalent to what the imaginary people are doing by subtracting explicitly the disconnected diagrams, but in Keldysh, formalism does it for you.
Are they imaginary people or imaginary?
Well, okay, so this we had already, but now if you do this way, you only get, for a given Monte Carlo run, you only get one value of the green function, for instance. So it's good for thermodynamic quantities, but if you want the spectral function, for instance, it's not really useful. So the next step is actually to expand this determinant over the last row, right? So here, sorry. And so if you expand the determinant over the last row, you get a sum of these green functions times the corresponding minor, so the determinant without this row and column. And now you check that since time only appears in the last row, you get something which actually doesn't depend on t. Okay, so now using this trick, so now you can expand, you can actually, so we call that the kernel. So you write your green function now is a convolution of these green functions here, times a kernel that does not depend on t, so you can actually bin this kernel and get in one computation all the different times or all different frequencies. And the last trick is to realize that this kernel here, k, is actually it's actually a trick that we didn't invent. It comes from NRG people. This kernel is itself a correlation function, in particular this one. So you can actually re-expand this correlation function in terms of another determinant, and that lowers the noise significantly, especially at high frequency. And unfortunately, you cannot keep going like this. You can only do it twice. But okay, that's how we essentially do it. Okay, so right now, so that's essentially it. I'm not going to give you more details, but essentially, so now you can actually directly sample bin this kernel, and from that you get the green function, and from the green function we get the self-energy. We don't bin directly the self-energy, we bin the green function, and then we use the recursively compute the self-energy. Okay. So now I go to the second part, how do we do this analytical continuation, how we do this resummation. Before I do it, I'd like to make a comment. So everything we do here, we do directly for a very large time, so directly in the stationary limit. And it's very important to note that in this business, limits very often do not commute. So here, if I do a computation for finite time, so this, for instance, is a series for the current. So the coefficient as a function of n for finite time, for very small time, and then increased time. And you see actually you have a fit here with something of the order t to the power n divided by factorial n, and you can actually show that this is an exact bond. So the series for any finite time is always fully convergent. It has an infinite radius of convergence. And for this actually we have a mathematical proof. Right, what you see that now, when you increase time, it converges to something stationary. And this is what we are going to do. So we are not going to use a convergence series, we are going to use a series which has a finite radius of convergence. So and then we are going to resum this series. We could, both are possible, but this is what we choose to do here. Okay, it's related to a question I had from Boris 2 years ago. And that's very important to see that we are not computing physical quantities here. We are computing order by order. So for a given order, things can get convergence that you cannot necessarily get for a physical quantity at finite u. Okay. So the first, so essentially the technique, I'm going to illustrate it with a Kondo temperature. And the way I define the Kondo temperature is we take the self-energy, the real part of self-energy, we fit it with a linear term in frequency, and then we define it essentially as the width of the Lorentzian. Okay, so this definition is here. And so, if you...
So gamma is just a bare parameter in the model here?
Yes. That's my definition of the self-energy. I fit this order by order. So if I do this, and I truncate the series, I get a different blue dash curve here. So you see that I have a finite radius of convergence. So it's after above u equal 5 or something, adding terms does not help. The red here is actually the final result that we have reconstructed. The dashed here is an exact result coming from Bethe and Zepf. I will talk about it a little bit later. And the black points correspond to the energy data from Serge. Okay. And I'd just like to say that we really did a double-blind experiment here because we didn't know about the exact result when we did the things. The referee pointed out it's Bethe and Zepf result from Horvatik and Zorti, and we didn't know about that. So it really came after the paper was completed.
Can you comment on the width of the red line?
Yes. Let me go back to that in 3 slides. So so the idea again, we call that the separation hypothesis. So essentially, you don't need to know exactly where are the poles. What you need to know is where there are no poles, right? So the hypothesis is that you have your series. You see a finite radius of convergence. So it means that so it corresponds to this white circle here. So it means that somewhere on this circle there is at least a pole or branch cut or something that bothers you. Okay. So what you need to know, and you want to calculate here for this value u0. What you need to know is a region here defined by this circle where there are no poles. You don't need to know exactly where are the poles, but you need to know a region where there are no poles, and then you will map this region. So you will use a change of variable to map this region toward an interior, toward the unit circle, essentially. And then this point will be actually inside the unit circle. And since there are no poles, then the radius of convergence will actually be bigger, and then you can actually compute for this value of u. That's really the idea. And so really we spent a lot of time trying out to find how we could check whether where are the poles, where there are no poles. So you can do change of variables, look at the radius of convergence of the modified series, and then it tells you, okay, it's pretty good. So you can go back and here and here I have no poles, and little by little you reconstruct the theoretical structure. So for instance, one thing that you can do is you can compute the series order by order for 1 over tk. And then 1 over tk, for instance, has a larger radius of convergence than tk. Could be. It happens to be the case for this case. And if it has a larger radius of convergence, then you can compute it outside of the radius of convergence of tk. And if you do it, you find actually the zeros of 1 over tk. And you see that they accumulate here for different orders. And these zeros of 1 over tk must be the poles of tk. So this way you can actually find the poles, simplest way. Yeah, why did I put this plot? I can't remember. This is actually how the evolution of this coefficient times u to the power n as a function of n. Or you see in this case, it's actually a divergent series. So it increases for this value of u. Actually, so we add so now we have the exact series for 1 over tk, for tk. And so the exact zeros are exactly here. So the Bethe and Zepf solution actually confirmed what we found in the analysis. Okay, second step is to design this conformal transformation. And so 2 years ago we had this earlier one. Now we have a whole bunch of them. We have a small catalog that we're growing slowly. And what is important is that you should not focus on the transformation itself. For instance, these are 2. What you should focus on is what maps onto the unit circle. For instance, if you take Euler, it essentially maps half the plane onto the unit circle. Okay, so the blue maps to blue, red to red, and so on and so forth. So if the point you want to calculate, for instance, is at the limit between red and blue, right? If there is no pole around here, then you will map it on you will converge on, let's say, first pole is at the limit between blue and green, then you will have a nice radius of convergence because it will be actually so you have margins to converge. And so this is a case where it's a linear separation. Here is a parabola, and you can actually play with this parabola, change it, move it around, and you could take different forms. We also played a bit with Schwarz-Christoffel, where you actually have kinks, so you can actually really match different poles if you know where they are to try to avoid them as much as possible. So once you have your transformation, so W of u that you know exactly, this is your input, you invert it term by term, so you need only the series of u of w. And then you construct f of w, which is f of u of w, so it's just convolution of two series, that's very simple. And you look at the radius of convergence of this guy, and then you take your u that you are interested in, map it to w, and you see whether it's converged or not. That's pretty straightforward. So for instance, for this particular case, we had a divergent series, and here it sees that it's on the onset of convergence. But we took a slightly smaller value of u, then it should be perfectly converging. And there is a third step, which we call Bayesian inference. And that's, so essentially here, it's again tk versus u. And all these red lines correspond to resampling, to bootstrapping the coefficient. So I calculate all my coefficient with a given error bar. And then I generate, let's say, 10,000 series compatible with these error bars. And I resum every single one of them. Okay? And you see that, okay, initially at small u, it gives me something reasonable, but eventually the noise I have is too large, and everything starts to diverge. But then it's not something, then you can start to use added information. So what we call Bayesian inference is just a controlled way to add more information that we have, on the side. On this particular case, we know that the tk has to go to 0 at u equal infinity. So essentially what we do is we post-select out of these guys the one that goes to 0 at t equal infinity. Okay, and we do it in a so you want to do it in proper way. You don't want to do like overfitting. So we have essentially a parameter epsilon that tells us how much weight we put on the guys around 0. And that's actually the final curve that we eventually get. So that's actually the answer. So this parameter epsilon, when you take it to be small, essentially you go to converge value, and if you go to epsilon very, 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 very small, then essentially you select only one guy, and then you might be in trouble. But
Can I ask a very simple question?
Sure.
Is it a single parametric family? Because if it would be multi-parametric family, probably you would have crossings of the lines. So how come that the lines do not have crossings?
So we just have, again, I can only repeat the procedure. I had 10 coefficients with 10 error bars. And for each of these coefficients, I independently generate, according to a Gaussian, the same coefficients 10,000 times, and give me 10,000. And why it's actually so regular? I think it has to do with
that's my question. Do you have an idea of why it's so regular?
I think it has to do with the conformal transformation that we use that actually has this property, but we didn't investigate to this. Yeah. And so this is actually the result that we get. And these were the initial benchmark by a numerical randomization group. And we were pretty happy. So if you look at at this scale, it looks like what we are doing is pretty good. Now, if you look at this, you see that there is a finite precision, and we could not really account for it. But then came the referee on the exact result, and it turns out that the exact result is exactly on top of the QMC. So we had better precision than energy, which were already pretty intense energy, and not like each energy point is over 3-4 days, over I don't know how many cores. And so eventually Serge redid the energy, and he was able to improve. And so now we get this. So you see the dashed line correspond to the better on that, and the dotted to energy. So we are still better than energy. So essentially we have something like 3 digits of precision on this contact temperature. Okay, so that's essentially the procedure. Now I can just show you data. So that's the first one. So it's at equilibrium. So this is a spectral function at u equal 9. You see again quantum Monte Carlo versus NRG, and it's actually fairly good. The small discrepancy here for the Hubbard peak, Serge really agrees that it's probably the problem of energy, which is not really a good method for high energy things. So here we have the real part of the self-energy and the imaginary part of self-energy versus frequency. So this is dedicated to Antoine. So Antoine asked Olivier,
No.
and then Olivier asked me, and then I asked Corentin, and Corentin couldn't ask anyone, so he just computed it. Actually, it's interesting because you see, for instance, for this particular case, which is a symmetric particle Hall case, already order 2 is actually pretty good. But if you take the self-energy and you zoom, for instance, close to 0 energy, then you see that then you can start to see really the discrepancy between the higher order.
That self-energy is much more sensitive.
It's much more sensitive, of course. Yeah.
But the Z is not so sensitive.
Can
So-
you repeat the question? There was a question.
No, it was a comment.
Yeah, but we can't hear.
Say that Z is not as sensitive as the self-energy.
Yeah, the M sigma is quite sensitive. The real sigma, the slope of real sigma through 0 is much, much less sensitive.
Okay.
That was all.
Yeah. So this is the radius of convergence that we observe as a function of frequency. You see that it's minimum around the frequency around 2. And on top, you have the position of the poles that we actually calculate, and you see that they really match, meaning that most probably we did find the poles. And the poles are here, so as a function of frequency, when you increase frequency, they move on the imaginary plane, U square plane, from there to there. And that's really what actually allows us to do this resummation in a controlled way. More data on the now asymmetric case, so now epsilon d is not 0. And that's interesting because now you see that when you switch on interaction, you have to build your Kondo resonance at the Kondo at the Fermi level. So it does something like beside just reducing the width of the peak. And now you see, if you look at self-energy, you see that second order is not good anymore. So you really need to go to higher orders even to get qualitatively the good physics. So again, in one calculation, we get the full frequency on interaction plot. So you can actually make this nice color pops. So when you switch on interaction, and you see that Kondo peak gets thinner and thinner, and you start to see this Kondo, this Hubbard side peaks that start to go away. And if you do it for epsilon d equal 1, so outside of a symmetric case, you see that you actually not only get thinner, but also you need to go back to epsilon equals 0, to omega equals 0 to build your Kondo peak. So you can really see how we build the Kondo resonance on the side peaks. Okay, and I'm almost at the end. So this is the first slide I showed you. So in the next talk by Emmanuel, you will see very similar data, but from a totally different technique. We try to put them on top. So you see that's not exactly on top yet. We don't think it's a problem with the calculation at this point. It's just that we don't have the same bass. So they used a bass which has a width of 10, and we use 500, and also the time is different. They use t equal 8, and we use 50. So the different methods are not good for the same. I mean, there are some regions which are easy for us are difficult for them, and some things that are easy for them are difficult for us. So it's okay. But this point we should be able to calculate both. So eventually, I hope before the end of this workshop, we will have some data that fall on top of each other. Yeah, Corentin. But at least, I mean, qualitatively, so we get the splitting of the peak, and so, I mean, at least qualitatively, we're already matching. And that's essentially it. I think I have one more. No, I have 2 more slides. Sorry. This is the current versus voltage. There we could benchmark by the early work by Philipp Werner and also Andy and others, and we get the same result. Okay, now we can go also to small bias. Which means long time, so we can get this plot. So for the symmetric case, small bias is not so interesting because small bias means perfect transmission, which means that the results are not modified by the interaction. But now when you go to something with epsilon d, which is 1 here, now you need to actually, when you switch on interaction, for instance, the blue curve, you actually need to build your Kondo resonance, and actually, so you see that the slope goes for whatever it was, to 1 at full frequency. You have here a zoom of this part. So we can really see that the transmission goes to 1 when we switch on interaction. And just to show you, this is where we were 2 years ago. So now I'm showing you 8, and 2 years ago we had essentially 2.4. So this resummation, the improved, I mean, all the small improvement, essentially it adds up to unlocking, I would say, interesting regimes. And this is the last slide. So it's something I don't totally understand, but I show it to you nevertheless because I find it nice. So we can calculate the JLSR, and we can also calculate the spectral function. I showed you the spectral function. And so at equilibrium, whatever is the interaction, the ratio of the two should always be the Fermi function. So I'm going to take that as a definition of my well, out of equilibrium Fermi function or distribution function in my system. Now, without interaction, we know it should be a double step. So essentially corresponding to the 2 Fermi level in my 2 reservoirs, of which is essentially my V bias. So here it's one case where the resummation was really straightforward. It's a perfectly alternative series, and we could go up to the U equal infinity without any Bayesian inference or anything. And you can really show it's actually pretty funny. You don't get any like effective temperature or something like that you could expect. What you get is essentially 2 jumps, but of finite widths now, and then something with a linear shape here, and then something like that. I cannot say I totally understand the physics behind that, but it's compatible with what you find from perturbation theory. There is an old paper from perturbation theory. But just to illustrate that we can start to calculate even, not only current versus bias voltage, but we have essentially access to any variable that we are interested in. And with this, I will conclude. So I'd say that for me, it's pretty interesting time in this diagrammatic Monte Carlo in general. I mean, we essentially, you saw the talk of Michel this morning. You start to be, I would say, it looks like the problems that we had, we are not there anymore. So we don't know what are going to be the next problems. But at least for the time being, there is a lot of things that we can do until we see, what are the real new limitations. So there are many technical improvements that we can still do and that we are working on. For instance, the way we are sampling things is terrible now, and we already have nice ideas how to improve that. You saw the idea of terms and content terms that we are also working on. That of course, changing the beginning, the starting point of the series changes everything in this business. Then terms of what we sample, we could sample the self-energy, we could directly sample in W variables. So we have a long list of ideas. We don't know which ideas are good, which one ideas are bad, but there are many things that could be improved still. And then we are saying it's time for us now also to move out of the, I would say, to get into the center of the swimming pool, move out of the border. So we started to work on lattices, Hubbard model. We started to work on DMFT. And my personal interests are more in the nanoelectronics thing. So I also started things on the 0.7 anomaly, and also for qubits. I think it can be very interesting. So I will stop there, and thank you for your attention.